welcome back everybody to another episode of Man Bites Film. This week we're going to be doing a special presentation on a documentary that I found very interesting. It's actually a series of documentaries put together. It runs about 7 hours total, and it's basically the history of the liberation of Cuba all the way up to modern times. And it's separated into 8 different segments. Each one runs about 50 minutes or so. And honestly, this is probably the best documentary I've seen about the history of Cuba. A lot of the documentaries that I've seen that are on Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, all that stuff, they're very they lean more towards the communist side of the story, and being raised by a Cuban family, that it's like being a traitor in my opinion. So honestly, any of those stories and documentaries are just complete bullshit, in my opinion. And this documentary, it doesn't give you a side, it just gives you the information overall, which I think is very fascinating, and it makes you make up your own mind about it. So I think that's very useful, and I think it's poignant because you can make up your own mind on what worked and what didn't work. So the first segment of this, it actually starts off and reviews the 4 centuries of Spanish rule that Cuba basically had, and right before the Declaration of Independence that they did. And this goes into the story of how the Spanish came to the island and they basically wiped out all indigenous Indians that were there. Completely wiped out. So every Cuban is pretty much Spaniard. There's no mix between the indigenous life and the Spanish at all. Like every other Latin American country in existence, they all have a mix of indigenous with Spanish. And Cuba is the only country that completely wiped out their indigenous people. And after that, the second part goes into the flourishing, the independence, and where they found their main agricultural production, which is all sugar. So the third segment it revolves around prohibition and how Cuba gave the Mafia the foothold that they needed to continue their gambling monopoly and their prohibition monopoly in the United States. And everybody that was in the United States and was able to get away and go to these casinos and these like free-for-all bars basically that they had. And it gave Cuba it became the capital of tourism in South America because of the Mafia's influence. Everybody in the United States wanted to go there. It was the original Las Vegas before Las Vegas became its thing now. And Cuba basically grew even further and even more powerful because of this. And after that, in the 60s, mid-50s, early 60s, the rebellious movement that actually basically started all this craziness that we have now happened. And basically it started because this guy Batista took over the country and said, F you guys, I'm taking over and I don't care what you guys say. And basically the story of every other Latin American country repeated itself in Cuba, and a dictator took hold of Cuba. Well, the Cubans didn't stand for that, so the rebellions started around the country. 3 different major rebellions. The first one was in Havana, and it was basically by the university students and stuff like that. And what they were trying to do was bring down the dictatorship of Batista and put in place the original democracy that was instituted. And then the next big movement was Santiago, and they wanted to do the same thing. But there was one other person that was expelled from the country, and this was Castro. Castro ended up going to Mexico and started building his foundation there and contacting the other 2 rebel factions and trying to get them on board with him. What they didn't know, though, was that he had with him one of the worst war criminals this planet has ever seen. I mean, the Cuban people put this guy up there with Hitler. That's how bad he is. And this is the wonderful, just god awful man called the Che. And yes, the you know, those really green shirts with that guy that everybody thinks is so cool because you're a hipster and he looks awesome. Yeah, well, no, he's not. He's he's a freaking murderous, ravenous, just crazy guy. Okay, and nobody understands that until you actually study the history of Cuba and understand what this guy did to the Cuban people. Okay, a lot of people wear his shirt and wear his little pins and all this stuff, and the what do you call it, the certain bands like to put their his image in their background and all that stuff. Well, this guy is a murderer, and he's straight up there. He created the Cuban Holocaust, as you could call it. He literally killed hundreds of thousands of people. Okay, and that's what these people worship. So the Che was just a really god-awful person, but they didn't know that. They didn't know that he was gonna bring the communist ideals to Castro. He's the one that influenced Castro to go into these Marxist ideals and actually put them in place when he did take power eventually. And that's what the next one goes into. The fifth segment goes into the confrontation between the Castro brothers, Camilo Cienfuegos, and the Che, and the division that it caused between them. Castro decided, like every other dictator, he doesn't trust anybody. So what did he do? He got rid of the different factions. Cienfuegos was another big faction that came about with the Castro brothers. He's the one that gave the guerrilla warfare techniques and strategies and everything. The man was like a brain for military strategy. And Castro didn't want that out there, because if another revolution happened, Cienfuegos would have gone and helped that revolution happen. So he was like, no, we're getting rid of him. And then eventually the Che too, because he was getting too powerful and getting too strong of an influence on the Cuban people. As much as I don't understand how, but he did. So he got rid of him as well. Then the sixth segment of this documentary goes into the Soviets and how the Soviets started using Cuba as like a, what do you call it, a second arm of Russia to be able to launch attacks or pretend that they were going to launch attacks against the US. And this caused the whole Cuban Missile Crisis to happen and all this craziness that ensued because of it. And there's a famous incident that happened, the Bay of Pigs invasion, that this was basically the Cuban people getting together and saying, we're not going to let you take over our country. We're not going to stand for this. So all the Cuban people that had influence, that had money, that had arms, that had just the manpower and training, were training outside in the Everglades of Miami for almost, I think it was 6 or 7 years. They were training in guerrilla warfare and strategizing how they could take, what motivations they could do to get control of Cuba. And they went to the US government and actually asked for aid from the famous JFK. And he said, yes, we'll give you the air support you need, because they had everything else. They had tanks, they had troops, they had boats that they can use. They had everything else except air support. And that's what they needed. That was the key ingredient that they needed. So they got the okay from the CIA. They got the okay from JFK personally that said, yes, I guarantee you will be there. And then suddenly JFK decides to pull out and say no, the day the invasion happened. So all these Cubans that were there on the land trying to take over, they had no air support. And what did the Castro government do? Wipe them out completely, because their strategy was based around the air support that they were guaranteed to have. So if you ever wonder why the Cuban people are so Republican or so leaning towards the right, a lot of it is because of the betrayal of JFK and the Democrats as a whole caused back then, and how much of a betrayal it was. And yes, Cubans are very, like, if you betray us, you're done. You're written off. You're completely, that's it, gone. All right. So, going back into the different segments, the seventh segment revolves around the USSR falling apart and how Cuba was able to try to hold its people together and hold the country together. A lot of things that happened in this time was basically the Cuban government trying to let go of all the assets that they didn't need. So they did the Mariel boatlift that basically they emptied out all the prisons and they told any of the Cubans, anybody that wants to leave, go. There's going to be a particular port that you're allowed to get picked up by any of your relatives as long as they got a boat and they can take you across the river, the canal. And they did. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Cubans ended up fleeing into Miami, and it made Miami one of the biggest cities in Florida because of this. And this is why Miami is such a stronghold for the Hispanic culture, is because Cubans, that's where they migrated to, because they wanted to be as close to Cuba as possible if something happened. And they want every Cuban's ideal is to go back home. Go back to Cuba. Go back where they came from. Because that is their home. And every Cuban's heart that I've ever spoken to that was born in Cuba says that they will eventually go back to Cuba. And that's amazing. Most Hispanic people, they don't want to go back to their country. Because they fled it because for a reason. Cubans do. They want to liberate their country. They want to bring back what they originally had, which was gold. It was amazing. It was idealistic. And everybody that was Cuban and born here, we're raised with those stories of idealistic society, about the beautiful landscapes, the beautiful government, the way that the people were, the freedoms that were ensued on us as children, and we're raised with those ideals. And honestly, the way that I was raised as a Cuban, it was, I will go fight for that country. I would give my life for Cuba. I've never stepped foot on Cuba. And that's the crazy thing about the Cuban culture, is that that's the type of fervor that we have, and that type of devotion to our country. And you don't see that in most Hispanic cultures. There's few that have it, but not as much as the Cuban culture. So I really like how this documentary allows that to open the door and hear those stories happen. And the last and final segment is about Venezuela's influence in the Castro brothers and how they were able to sort of survive with the help of Venezuela, and the final betrayal of the United States and the Democrats, which was Mr. What's-His-Face, that I will refuse to say his name anymore, allowed to take off the embargo and just help the Castro brothers and help the communist regime that is there. So yes, Obama is the worst president since JFK to Cubans, because this man opened up the door and gave money. He's like, here, have money, you freaking communist. I don't care if you're communist. I don't care if you're killing people. I don't care if you're violating human rights after rights after rights after rights, because I'm a left-wing kook just like you guys. So yes, the Democrats continue to ensue their propaganda to the Cubans, and we just don't buy it anymore. These guys are full of it. And this documentary analyzes that a lot in this last segment. And they go into the story of how the US is trying to help Cuba, even though there are violations of human rights all over the place. And on top of that, they're a communist country, and they do the same thing with China. It's just ridiculous. And I think that this documentary is very good at analyzing these different aspects and giving the full perspective, the full point of view, and allowing you to see all sides of the story. So again, check this out. This is on Netflix streaming. It's called Cuba Libre Story, and it runs about 7 hours total. It's a 2015 documentary. I give it an 8 out of 10. There's some aspects and some of the segments that are directed, and they lean more towards something that I don't appreciate and point of views that I don't appreciate. But then again, that's just me. As a casual viewer, this documentary is definitely a 10 out of 10 because it gives the right information. It's just obviously I didn't like some of the right information, so I didn't appreciate it, and I was fighting with the screen sometimes and all that stuff. So yeah, it's definitely that type of documentary that you end up talking to the screen and all that stuff, especially if you were born or raised Cuban. It's just something we do. So anyways, Cuba Libre story. I hope you guys enjoyed this segment and this little history lesson that I was able to give you. And we'll see you guys next week for another episode of Man Bites Film.